Hello, class. This is a lecture on the Neo-Freudians. And so, neo, of course, just as a prefix meaning new. And so, this lecture is going to cover the many, many, many therapists and philosophers and theorists that came after Sigmund Freud. And so, while Sigmund Freud was alive, he attracted worldwide attention, and many people were very intrigued by what it is that he had to say. And many people came to study under him, and his influence was very, very wide reaching and went all the way around the world and made him very internationally famous. And this week, we're going to, in this part one of this lecture on Neo Freudians, we're going to be talking about the most famous of Freud's disciples. And he had dozens and dozens of them, but a few of them became extremely famous and influential in their own right. And we still talk about these psychologists and psychiatrists to this day. The first and most important of, and certainly the most famous of Freud's followers, was a Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Gustav Jung, Jung. Carl Jung was the son of a pastor, so a PK, as we nickname those people, a pastor's kid, and grew up in Zurich, Switzerland, and became very interested in Sigmund Freud's writing. Jung, as opposed to Freud, was working with mentally ill people as a psychiatrist. So Freud, remember, was a neurologist. Carl Jung was a psychiatrist and was already working for many years at a psychiatric hospital in Zurich. And that hospital, by the way, is still open to this day. And Carl Jung's house can still be toured to this day. And there's a Jungian Institute in Zurich that can still be visited to this day. In some respects, Carl Jung has followers that are even more devoted to him than Sigmund Freud's followers are today. His name is not as famous as Sigmund Freud's, but his followers are extremely enthusiastic. And I think you may like Carl Jung as well once you get to know a little bit more about him. They met each other through correspondence via mail, which was how things were mainly done back then. Finally, they did meet, and Carl Jung became so much involved in Freud's inner circle that many people felt that the younger Carl Jung, he was younger than Freud by I think over 10 years, that he was going to be the heir to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic empire. But alas, there was a falling out between he and Freud. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud split over two main issues. The most important one is that Carl Jung did not believe that childhood was the most important time in a person's life, and he certainly did not think that childhood helped to determine the entire future of a human being. Carl Jung believed that middle age was the most important part of a person's life, and he reasoned this. He gave two reasons for this. He said, number one, when you're younger, you are much more preoccupied with being obedient and doing what is right. When you're young, you just want to you tend to do a lot of copying. If you notice, a lot of kids in school, they all tend to wear the same kind of clothes and wear the same perfumes or colognes, or wear the same kinds of jeans or the same kinds of shoes, or they wear their hair a certain way. Young people tend to be a bunch of copiers and imitators. And even when a child grows into their teens and finally into their young adult years, they're still very, very much preoccupied with making the correct choices, or what they perceive to be the correct choices. I got to get into the right school. I have to hang out with the right friends. I have to have a certain kind of body type. I have to be in a certain kind of shape. I have to look a certain way. I have to read the right books. I have to know the right things. I have to choose the right person to marry. I have to buy the right car. I have to buy the right house. I have to live in the right neighborhood. And Jung said that people in their 20s and 30s are very preoccupied with these things, and these are largely very boring things. Even though they are very important in a person's life at the time, or at least they seem important, he said in the grand scheme of things, these kinds of preoccupations are very boring and very shallow and very dull. He said middle-aged people who don't care so much about doing things the right way, they want to do things that are courageous, They want to do things that are honest. They want to do things that are virtuous. They want to love other people and give deeply of themselves to other people. They start becoming preoccupied in middle age with the things in life that really matter. And so he said middle age is really the most determinative time in a person's life. Plus, he just felt that people who were young were very boring to talk to. Uh, People just get a lot more interesting as they get older and they start living a life that looks a lot more like a life of wisdom and integrity. So he developed a very strong cult like following. He also disagreed with Freud over something else. He believed, even though he did very much believe in the unconscious, as we'll soon come to find out, um, Jung believed a little bit more strongly in the idea that a person's conscious thoughts can be as important as their unconscious thoughts. And Freud completely disagreed with this. So after these two things, there was a falling out between them, and they were no longer friends. And Carl Jung went on his own way, and Freud continued on his way. Freud practiced psychoanalysis. Carl Jung's approach was called analytic psychology, and he believed that the most basic task of a therapist is to take care of a person's soul. He said the church is usually a very good place where the care of souls could take place, and that the church has great potential to love people and take care of people. But he said that the needs that people have are so enormous that the church could never meet that need by itself, that there needs to be a profession dedicated to the care of souls. And he said that's exactly what a good therapist or counselor ends up becoming. So here's Carl Jung. Those are his dates, 1875 through 1961. Fortunately, we have, because he lived into the 1950s and 60s, Carl Jung has several recorded lectures and interviews that still survive to this day. As far as we know, there is only one audio recording of Sigmund Freud that survives to this day. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it is on YouTube the last time I checked. But there's plenty on Carl Jung on YouTube beyond just that one interview. Carl Jung placed less of an emphasis on sexuality, so this was yet another area of disagreement. Whereas Freud did emphasize sex, but in particular, what Freud emphasized in terms of sexuality had far less to do with the act of sex. In fact, it had much more to do with the sexual urges or the sexual id that would cause a lot of maladjustment, especially if it was stifled. But Jung believed that most of the problems that plague a person are problems that that person is aware of. Jung was also very famous for developing the two major personality types of introversion or extroversion. So to this day, if you hear someone say, I'm an introvert, or if you hear someone else say, I'm an extrovert, these were terms invented by Carl Jung. And he also invented basically what we now consider to be the Myers-Briggs type indicator, with its four subtypes of intuiting, sensing, feeling, and thinking, and their opposites. So these subtypes tend to be derivatives of introversion and extroversion. Some of the principles of analytical psychology. Carl Jung believed that our personality contains a psyche, this Greek term that basically refers to our soul, the kind of the foundation of who we are. It's not quite the same thing as our body. It's that sense of individual identity that lies at the heart of each person. He calls this the psyche. And he believed that this psyche was more than just your own self. It was also a kind of a life force that surrounded every living thing. Now, if this sounds a little bit like Star Wars, believe it or not, a lot of Carl Jung's thoughts were copied by George Lucas and were included in Star Wars. So as we continue with Carl Jung here, see if you can't detect a few things that sound like Star Wars. But anyway, he believed that every person had a psyche, and that psyche connected you to all other living things, and it connected you also to all living things that used to be alive but are now dead. But he believed in the immortality of the soul. He said that a healthy person is someone who lives in balance or harmony with one's psyche. So there's your self, which is your ego, and then your psyche is this deep, deep, deep part of yourself that is also connected to other things. And a big part of that is our unconscious. So there is an area of great similarity with Freud. He believed that the unconscious shaped our lives very significantly, in addition to our conscious lives. He believes that when we are sick or unhealthy, another name for that would just be pathology, is when we overcompensate when we are out of balance. So think of a tightrope walker who's trying to maintain his balance walking down this um, very thin cable, and he begins to lose his balance and fall over to the right. And as he feels himself falling over to the right, all of his energies go to overcorrect and send him over onto the left. And in fact, he falls over on the left hand side, even though he was initially losing his balance on the right. Carl Jung believed that there are many examples of how we do this in our own lives. We may notice a problem area, and then in order to address or fix that problem area, we end up going too far and making mistakes in the opposite direction. For example, let's say that there's a person who did not receive a lot of love in their home when they were growing up, and so they decide to overcompensate by trying to take love anywhere they can get it when they grow up, and they end up taking love very cheaply, and people take advantage of them, and they have very, very loose boundaries in terms of who they are spiritually and who they are physically. So those overcompensating gestures get us into some big trouble. Also, if we do not pay attention to that deep part of ourselves and learn from it, because Carl Jung believed that we have much to learn from the unconscious part of ourselves. And the unconscious part of ourselves is always trying to speak to us, and we should do a much better job, he argued, uh, of paying attention to what our unconscious lives are trying to tell us, because there's a lot of wisdom in our unconscious selves. Because remember, our psyche is not just a place where we reside, it's also this kind of force that connects us to all things. And therefore, that psyche has much to teach us, because it's the wisdom of all things that have been alive currently, or all the things that have been alive before us. So we need to stop and listen, and our insides will tell us much, much, much that we never thought was there. So if that sounds a little spiritual, a little bit kind of um, not grounded in reality a little bit, well, maybe so, but Carl Jung nevertheless has had mass appeal. We've already indicated that Carl Jung prefers middle age to childhood in terms of area of importance, and we talked about the examples of how young people tend to be more concerned with making the right choices, but older people are much more concerned with the bigger questions in life: integrity, freedom, how to do things honestly, how to do things courageously, how to live sacrificially, how to love another person. These are the real things in life, and this is what really matters: staying true to yourself. And so he also believed that older people do a much better job telling the truth to themselves. He says the young people are so driven by their particular goals that they sometimes silence themselves or censor or edit themselves, whereas old people are much more likely to speak truthfully to themselves about themselves. And so he believed it was far easier to work with an older person on confronting their unconscious selves and emerging on the other side of therapy in a much healthier place. Analytical psychology, as proposed by Freud, was basically divided into two big parts. One was the conscious world, which was the world driven by your ego. This is the stuff that you're largely aware of day in and day out. And then your unconscious, which is a huge, much larger part of yourself. So, in this way, he was very much in agreement with Sigmund Freud. These are uh, these are two parts of us. These two parts comprise us. But then Jung did something a little bit different than Freud. He went a little bit further in his theory of the unconscious. Look at this. He believed that our unconscious itself is divided into two more parts. One is called the personal unconscious, and the other is called the collective. The personal unconscious. This has to do with all of the things that pertain to you that you're not aware of that are still inside that mind of yours. It's unique to each person. It's not shared with anybody else. It's your individual experiences. And many of these things, some things you can remember, but that would not be part of your unconscious. That would be part of your conscious. But there are many things that your body remembers, that your soul remembers, that's very personal to you, that you can't call attention to at a moment's notice because you're not aware of it, but it still influences your life. This one is much more personal. It's autobiographical. This one he called the personal unconscious. Now that's very important, but here, this next point, this is maybe Carl Jung's most famous contribution um, that he ever developed and proposed, having to do with psychology and therapy, and that is the notion of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious, he believed, is the most powerful force in life. Carl Jung said that inside of every one of us was a shared unconscious that we share with the rest of the universe and all the people who are alive today and all of the people who came before us. This collective unconscious means more or less that Carl Jung believed that inside of every single person is the collected wisdom of the ages, all passed down into your personal space. And so, this is why when some people say, I'm not teaching you something you didn't already know, or when you think of Socrates, who argued that all education is the discovery of something that already existed inside of you. Um, the famous quote attributed to Socrates is, all education is recognition, meaning it was already inside of us. It was just a matter of recognizing that it was inside of us. The truth is out there, but it's inside of you, and it's just a matter of discovering this truth that's inside of every person. So, just like Socrates, Carl Jung believed that a good teacher was someone who taught you how to become more familiar with yourself and unlock the potentialities of your own mind. He didn't believe that these were things that were taught to you. The wisdom of life is carried inside of you and passed on to you through your ancestors. He would use, for example, how is it that a woman who was never taught very much about how to be a mother, when she has a baby, almost instinctively knows the right thing to do to take care of her baby? How is that possible? Jung would say that this kind of wisdom is unconsciously passed from one woman to the other, to the other, to the other. And you, as a woman who may have just given birth, are now the recipient of all of those millennia of wisdom that's been passed on to you. So just whenever you think of Carl Jung, it's very important to think of the collective unconscious, that humongous, enormous, powerful force in your life that you're not aware of, but that has nevertheless been passed down from all the generations to you. And it's inside of you, and it's just a matter of discovering it and unlocking its power. The collective unconscious is the immense cumulative inherited amount of information and experiences that are passed to us from culture to culture and person to person. It's the source of all creativity, wisdom, and all that has gone before us. It is incomprehensibly huge, deep, and overwhelming. This, as you may have possibly detected, sounds just like the Force that's discussed in Star Wars. When Ben Kenobi is trying to teach Luke Skywalker how to fight as a Jedi, he says, "Close your eyes and don't rely on your own senses." He said famously, "Your eyes deceive you. Don't trust them. Instead, you should lean into the Force and let the Force speak to you and speak its wisdom to you. It will show you the way." Well, that's something that makes for an interesting dramatic arc in a movie, but Carl Jung believed it to be absolutely true. He didn't call it the Force, he called it the collective unconscious, and he believed that it was absolutely true and that it existed inside of each person. Again, education, therapy, those are the settings where that kind of deep truth and wisdom come out. The collective unconscious contains archetypes. Because this kind of wisdom is so overwhelming and so voluminous, there's no way that we could possibly deal with all of it at once. And so what Jung believed was that inside the collective unconscious were these kind of characters. Imagine going into your bedroom and having in your bedroom closet a big collection of masks. And imagine that every single time you put on this mask, that you became the person that the mask represented. You turned into that person. Well, Jung said that inside of our own collective unconscious is a whole collection of masks. And the names he gave for these masks were archetypes. Archetypes are these kinds of characters or masks or roles that exist in our unconscious and conscious personalities, and we all use them. Now, notice I said these exist both in the unconscious and the conscious. It's both. Sometimes we are aware of the fact that we're putting on a mask and wearing it. Sometimes we're very unaware of the fact that we're putting on a mask and wearing it. But all of us use these masks, and they only become activated when we start relating to other people. Now you might say, well, what in the world is he talking about? What does he mean by these masks? Well, we'll talk about these masks a little bit. Um, but for now, just know that when there comes a time in your life when you have a problem, sometimes acting like a different person or becoming temporarily a different person can be very convenient. For example, you may not be a very strong leader, but what if you find yourself in a situation where there are a bunch of little kids and there are no other responsible adults around? You may not feel like the most responsible people in the world, but watch yourself. Watch what happens to you in that situation when you realize it's all up to me to be the leader of these children. You may put on that mask of being a leader and perform very, very well when you're put into that certain situation. Jung said we do this kind of thing all the time in our lives. Analytical psychology, continuing with Carl Jung, he believed that human behavior is governed by what we think is going to happen, not based on history. So history is not doomed to repeat itself, according to Jung. What is going to happen is not necessarily history, but what we expect will happen. Now that can be guided by history. If we're the kind of person that says, hey, the only thing that can happen is what has happened, then your behavior will be guided by history. But if your expectations differ from history or differ from experience, then you can have a new future. So he believed it's very important he believed it was very important to have goals and to really believe that these goals were going to come true, because he said they could shape your reality. Carl Jung, more than any other psychologist who ever lived, paid close attention to dreams. He believed that dreams was the place where the collective unconscious spoke to us, and therefore he required all of his patients to keep a dream journal, to write down all of your dreams and try to learn as much as you possibly could from your dreams, because your dreams could really, really benefit you. Now, remember, Sigmund Freud wrote a book. His first famous book was called The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. And he called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. He believed that in your dreams, that's where we reach the unconscious world. But for Freud, that was designed to solve a problem and to make a sick person well. For Carl Jung, he was interested in dreams not because a person was sick, but because that's where the source of wisdom was. So to look at your dreams is not just something that a sick person should do. To examine your dreams is something anyone should do, because that's where your unconscious is going to speak to you. Anything that seemed mystical, magical, fantastical, or spiritual was in play for Carl Jung. He was very much fascinated with cultures from around the world. He was interested in their symbols and their artifacts. He collected little trinkets from many cultures around the world, and he believed them to have great spiritual power. He also believed that was more important than even the objects themselves was your belief about what those objects would do. So if you very strongly believed that a necklace that you got in another country that has a pendant on the end of it that is very, very old is going to be a source of protection for you. Jung didn't necessarily believe that the necklace itself had that kind of power, but if you believed that it had that kind of power, then suddenly the necklace became all important. Jung, as the son of a pastor, would call himself a Christian, but I think he was much more open to all religions of the world, and he probably didn't make a boundary for himself around Christianity. He probably would say that all religions of the world were equally valid, and that all religions of the world had much to teach us. He also believed that God was in everything, present in everything, and so a good name for that would be a pantheist. He believed that the existence of God was absolute. This is another area where he really differed from Freud. Freud was an atheist, although there were some indications that he may have had some doubts about his atheism. Carl Jung absolutely believed in God and believed that God was real. He said, it's almost impossible to imagine God as not existing. All you have to do is open your eyes and look around, and you see evidence of some very, very intelligent, brilliant, all-powerful, cogent being behind everything. So, but he didn't really believe in a personal God. He more believed in this kind of dynamic force that was responsible for creating the entire world. He believed that God was in heaven, but he also believed that God was in a chair, or God was in uh, a bowl full of cherries, or God was at your school, or God was in your clothes. It didn't matter. God was everywhere. Carl Jung believed that there were no accidents. This is something that he also shared with Sigmund Freud. Every single thing that you do, every mistake that you make, every slip of the tongue, every single thing, no matter how irrelevant or minor or inconsequential it may seem, is meaningful, purposeful, guided by fate, and connected. We are all connected to each other in a very meaningful and special way. Um, Freud probably did not believe in ESP, extrasensory perception, but Carl Jung certainly did, and he coined the term synchronicity. Synchronicity refers to the meaningful coincidences that seem to give rise to the evidence that two things are connected. For example, I may wake up in my bed here in Clovis, California at 3 o'clock in the morning with pain in my head, and around halfway around the world, my best friend at the exact same time may have bumped his head on a pipe and experienced a great deal of pain in his head. Um, for some reason, he believed the universe was connected like that, and that every single thing that happens is there for a reason, and that we should learn from it. When he refers to synchronicity, he's just referring to all of the ways in which we're all connected to each other in meaningful but often hidden ways. So, what does it look like to do therapy with Carl Jung? Well, the goal of therapy, according to Carl Jung, was to become an individual. He called this process individuation. Individuation is where you integrate the unconscious and conscious worlds and start to form a distinct personality. If you did therapy with Carl Jung, he would tell you again and again to pay attention to all the little symbols and metaphors and themes in your language. He'd have you do lots of writing. He'd have you do lots of journaling. He'd ask you to do a dream journal, and then he would read it very carefully, and he would try to find evidence for how your unconscious was speaking to you and trying to teach you wise things. He said that one of the great things that we can do in this life is to take risks and to embrace the unknown. He said it's a very boring life when you just do the same thing again and again. He was a firm believer in adventure. He was a firm believer in taking risks, in trying something new, and putting your own stamp on your own life and becoming a true individual and not just someone who's a copycat of somebody else. He also said that it almost requires us to face the darkness in our life with courage, because our true self is often found in the darkness. Now, what I'm referring to here is the shadow. Now, one of the main archetypes of Carl Jung, we already talked about the archetypes, the masks that we wear. One of them is called the shadow. The shadow is this kind of dark character that resides in each one of us. He sometimes calls it the imposter. I think like a Christian would just probably call it the presence of the evil one inside of us. But what Jung said is that there's always an imposter that lives inside of us that is skeptical, doubtful. This imposter taunts us. This person tells us we'll never amount to anything. This person is consumed with doubt and fear and insecurity. And kind of just like in the movie Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker had to face the prospect of whether he was going to be a good Jedi or a bad Jedi, he felt this was in the Empire Strikes Back. He felt that urge to go into this dark and disgusting cave and see what was in there. And Yoda, his master, told him probably to stay away, but that it was necessary for him to go in and see what was there. And that was something that Luke had to do. It was a very personal journey. So when Jung says that the true self is found in the darkness, this was echoed in that Star Wars movie, in that scene in The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke had to go, and in this kind of crazy dreamlike state, he confronted Darth Vader, fought him in a brief lightsaber battle, cut off his head, only to find that the head that he had cut off was his own. And so it was a vision of what the world could be like and what he could become if he gave himself over to evil. Jung said that every person has to confront this dark side of us that trails us and hounds us and mocks us, and we have to stand up to it and be courageous in the face of it. As therapy continues, Jung believed that it was very important for a therapist to have a good relationship with each of his patients. He would very much try to enter into the subjective, phenomenological world of his clients, which just means that he tried to get to know all of their idiosyncrasies, their language, their history, the way they talk. It was very important for Jung to try to really get to know another person. And he said that your experience of counseling was far more important than the product or the outcome. So if you're the kind of person that wanted to come to therapy and have like 10 sessions and hopefully you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10, you move from, say, a 2 to a 7, Carl Jung is probably not your guy. He's much more interested in having a real relationship with you and having a real experience with you as a therapist. One of the criticisms of Jungian psychology is that because of how Jung operated, maybe he was best suited to treat highly educated, largely high functioning adults only. Some people question whether his form of therapy was really going to help people with everyday problems, just trying to get through the day and make it to the end of the week. Um, Nevertheless, training to become a Jungian therapist is very intense. It usually requires you to have a doctoral degree and then some extra years of training at a Jungian institute. These last two slides here, or last three slides, are a case study that we may go over in class, or I may have it for you as one of our forum discussions. But for now, that's a good place to stop part one, and we'll pick up part two here in just a moment.